Okay, hi everyone. Let me begin by thanking Laura for bringing us together and my chair as well. And let me also thank Velizar for introducing the subject I'm going to be speaking about very ably already. It's not every conference where Simmias of Rhodes comes up twice, let alone at all. So here I'll get started with new approaches to iconicity in the ancient Greek Technopaegnia. In this talk, I propose new hermeneutic strategies for approaching the Greek Technopaegnia, or really the shape poems, taking as my focus two examples from the early Hellenistic period, the wings and the axe of Simmias of Rhodes. The Greek shape poems constitute a distinctive microgenre of epigram, in which, as Velizar was describing, the poet manipulates the meter and in some cases the alignment of the text such that the lines are arranged to form the outline of an image related to the poem's semantic content. Though these poems were long dismissed as trivial curiosities, recent scholarship has been impressed by their sophisticated self-reflection on their own intermedial status as both text and image. By tracing a silhouette on the page, these poems cleverly literalize the mimetic aspirations of more standard Hellenistic book epigrams that attempt to represent an absent material object through literary ekphrasis. This formal conceit is complemented by the semantic content of these poems, which frequently play with this dichotomy of presence and absence by thematizing concepts like vision and invisibility, artifice, and the obscurity produced by riddling language. So in this talk, I will take the shape poem's artistic self-consciousness as a given, and I will attempt to advance the scholarly conversation surrounding these texts by investigating the effect of intermediality on the way that shape poems signify. My starting point is an insight from recent cognitive research into contemporary visual poetry, which provides empirical backing for the intuitive idea that shape poetry does not simply signify verbally and visually, but that there is also a dynamic interplay between these two modes of signification. In the words of one such study, quote, "In visual poetry, verbal signs perform pictorial tasks. They signify both by referring to an external signified and via their topographical position on the page and their structural interactions with other elements," end quote. It is this last aspect, the interaction between a word's semantic and iconic significances, that I explore today in paradigmatic readings of two shape poems by the probable Greek inventor of this literary form, the early 3rd century Alexandrian scholar-poet Simmias of Rhodes. But first, as a brief illustrative example of the dynamic in which I'm interested, I would adduce George Herbert's Easter Wings, one of the most famous shape poems in the English poetic tradition. The poem's subject is humanity's spiritual degeneration brought about by the biblical fall of man and its subsequent restoration through Christ's resurrection. There is a clear complementarity between this theme of loss and redemption and the literal waning and waxing of the individual lines that constitute each of the pair of wings formed by each stanza. Thus, as the first stanza begins, man in wealth and store occupies a full-length line, but decaying more and more, he becomes most poor at the center and shortest pair of lines in the stanza. Man's spiritual impoverishment is thus mirrored by the physical contraction of each successive verse. But then, as the speaker prays to rise, the lines begin to expand back to their original fullness. The same pattern plays out in the second stanza as well, in which the speaker and the verse again become most thin before being built back up by the grace of God and the poet, respectively. Now, as its name and form suggests, Herbert's poem is in fact modeled on one of the ancient Greek shape poems I have chosen for a case study today, namely Simmias's Wings, which I provided also as the front side of your handout. The Wings consists of 12 lines built from a choriambic base. By subtracting and then adding 1 foot per line, Simmias has contrived that the arrangement of the text form a stylized representation of a pair of wings, which functions as a metonym for swift-flying Eros, as he is described in line 9. On a verbal level, the poem is a riddling description of Eros, revolving around the paradox that although the god looks like an ephebic youth, he is in fact one of the oldest and most powerful divinities in the pantheon, not the son of Aphrodite, known from later tradition, but the hesiotic offspring of primordial chaos. This description is conveyed in the first person by Eros himself, or perhaps better, by a statue depicting the god in the tradition of ekphrastic epigram. So I'll now read a translation of the poem. Behold me, the lord of deep-bosomed earth, him who set aside the son of Acmon, which is to say Uranus, the sky god, and do not be shocked that someone so great should be burdened with shady down on his chin. I was born when necessity held sway, and all creatures of the land and of the air yielded to her gloomy will, as the child of chaos, not at all of Cyprus. I am called swift-flying, delicate Eros, for I did not gain power by force, but by gentle persuasion. The earth, the depths of the sea, and the brazen vault of heaven yielded to me. I took for myself their ancient scepter and began to lay down ordinances for the gods. As several scholars have noted, with the opening words, behold me, lausame, the poem already dramatizes its own intermediality as both text and image. Within the fictional scenario conjured by the poem, the pronoun me refers to a statue of Eros, whom the addressee is imagined as able to look upon, downy cheeks and all. But in the context of a shape poem, these words take on another meaning, inviting the reader to admire a shape on the page that symbolizes, through synecdoche, the same subject that the addressee notionally beholds. Thus, the speaker is on one level a statue of Eros, on another, the poem itself, qua image. Thus, in two words, Simmias has captured the distinctive dynamics of reception that this new genre demands of its readers. This opening reveals an artistic self-consciousness that I would argue extends throughout the poem, which I read as a metapoetic meditation on the nature of shape poetry itself. I begin from an observation made by Manuel Pérez Lopez, who points out that, as in Herbert's Easter Wings, Simmias matches form and content by placing poetically heavy material, like the deep-bosomed earth, in the poem's longest lines, whereas the shortest central lines refer to light and ethereal subjects. In fact, much more can be made of this insight, especially as regards the center of the poem. Lines 6 and 7 consist only of the final measure of the poem's choriambic verse, reading diaithros chauste, literally through the sky and of chaos. The collocation of aithra and chaos at this juncture in the poem seems marked. In the center of the text, precisely at the point where the lines are shortest and the gap separating the poem's two wings is deepest, Simmias uses first a word for clear sky, aithra, and then a word meaning space, the expanse of air, or any vast gulf or chasm, chaos. It is as though these words for empty air look out upon their pictorial equivalent in the blank space contained within the poem itself, a type of visual pun. In context, Eros is explaining that necessity ruled over all creatures, both on air and in the sky, at the time of his birth. And then he presents his genealogy. He is the child not of Aphrodite, but of chaos. Now, the key to understanding the metapoetic potential of Simmias's preference of this hesiotic genealogy lies in the double significance of the pronoun me in line 1. On one level, in lines 7 through 9, Eros, as speaker of the poem, claims to descend from chaos, not Aphrodite. But on another level, if we remember the metonymic slippage between the speaker Eros and the wings itself, qua shape poem that symbolically represents Eros, another reading suggests itself. The shape of the wings emerges from, and indeed is constituted by, the negative space, or the chaos, that surrounds it on the page. By this equation of Eros with the shape poem that signifies him, Simmias can be seen to reflect on a foundational paradox of the genre of shape poetry, which has recently been articulated by Alexandra Papas. In these epigrams, quote, the image of the object is necessarily defined on the page by the negative blank space around the lines. Thus, absence of image or words literally creates presence of image with words, end quote. I believe it is this metapoetic truth that Simmias enshrines in his paradigmatic epigram. As Eros was born from chaos, so the image of Eros produced by his wings, or indeed any shape poem, or any image produced in any shape poem, is given form by the empty space around it. I'll now move on to my second case study, which is Simmias's axe, and this is also provided on the back of the handout. This poem, I argue, exploits the semiotic potential of Simmias's intermedial genre even more fully than does The Wings. But before analysis can begin, first, a major textual issue needs to be addressed. The axe records the legendary carpenter Epeus's dedication to Athena of the axe that he used to build the Trojan horse, and thus secure a Greek victory in the Trojan War. The poem employs the same metrical schema as Simmias's Wings, except that the text of the axe is aligned axisymmetrically rather than to the left. The difficulty lies in the fact that in its received form, the axe is antithetic, an extremely rare type of poem whose lines must be read chiastically. That is, the reader is supposed to begin with the topmost line, then jump down to the bottommost line before returning to the second line from the top, and so on and so forth, gradually working her way inward to the center of the poem. Arranged thus, the text forms the shape of two counterbalanced triangles meant to represent the outline of Epeus's double-edged axe. I'll now again read a translation of the poem. Epeus of Phocis presented to Athena, the manly goddess, in gratitude for her sound advice, the axe with which he once brought down the lofty, god-built towers, at the time when he, with fire-breathing destruction, reduced to ashes the holy city of the Dardanids, that is Troy, and knocked its gilded lords from their secure seats. He was not numbered among the foremost Achaean fighters, but, little known, he used to carry water from pure springs. Now, however, he has gone along the road of Homer, thanks to you, wise and holy Pallas. Thrice blessed is he whom you look upon propitiously and with favor. Good fortune of that sort lives forever. The antithetic layout has the unanimous support of the manuscript tradition as well as the poem's scholia. Nevertheless, the poem's antithetic format has long been questioned, most recently by Jan Kvapisch in his 2013 commentary on the Greek shape poems. Building on the arguments of Hermann Fraenkel as well as Alan Cameron, among others, Kvapisch primarily objects that Simmias would not have needed to adopt such an unusual format in order to create a shape poem that resembled an axe. In the place of the received format, which he attributes to later meddling editors, Kvapisch proposes that the poem's lines were originally arranged in the standard consecutive order and read in linear fashion, as shown on this slide here. Maybe I can X that out. Okay, well, thank you. Here, I'll just continue talking. In this arrangement, Kvapisch argues, the poem resembles a single triangle, quote, which looks more like a carpenter's tool, end quote, than the traditional layout does. Kvapisch emphasizes that Epeus was a craftsman, not a soldier, and thus a single-headed axe, or an adze, would be more appropriate to him than a warrior's double axe. There are, however, serious problems with this argument, not the least of which is lexical. Although I've not seen it pointed out in scholarship, the poem's own word for axe, pellicus, in line 2, has as its primary meaning a two-edged axe for felling trees, to quote the LSJ. The LSJ further notes that in the funeral games of Patroclus in Iliad Book 23, the pellicus is conceptually opposed to the single-edged hemi-pellikon, which literally translates to something like half of a double axe. Another Homeric passage is equally instructive. In constructing his raft to escape Calypso's island, Odysseus first uses a pellicus, which is here explicitly described as double-edged, sharpened on both sides, in order to fell trees for timber. He then uses an adze, or a skeparnon, as a smoothing tool. Simmias's use of the word pellicus thus proves that he imagined Epeus's axe as double-edged. Furthermore, the Odyssey passage just deduced shows that such axes are not used only in battle, they're also a part of the craftsman's toolkit. Indeed, the double-edged axe is one of the attributes of Hephaestus, the divine craftsman himself, who famously uses the instrument to facilitate the birth of Athena from the head of Zeus. Moreover, in narratives covering the preliminaries of the fall of Troy, Epeus regularly fells trees on Mount Ida in order to collect timber for the construction of the Trojan horse, both in Proclus's summary of the Little Iliad and in later sources like Quintus or Tryphiodorus. Epeius would thus have good reason to use a pellicus in building the Trojan horse. These arguments should be sufficient to defend the traditional layout of the poem, but I would like further to address one of the assumptions undergirding Kvapisch's intervention, namely that Simmias would have only resorted to an antithetic arrangement of the text if some compositional need had compelled him to do so. This argument ignores the possibility that Simmias could rather have had aesthetic purposes in mind. The antithetic arrangement dovetails nicely with Simmias's well-known penchant for experimentation with novel poetic forms, and I would argue that this layout enriches the poem's meaning in at least two major ways. First, virtually every other shape poem is more or less riddling, but if read in its traditional antithetic order, the Acts is far and away the least obscure exemplar of the genre. The Acts is genuinely baffling, however, if the first-time reader does not yet know that it must be read antithetically and tries a linear approach instead. The reader who makes this attempt will meet with a passage that is grammatically difficult and quite abstruse, but still technically legible until lines 9 and 11, where the grammar finally breaks down. Approached thus, the top half of the poem would read, "The Phocian, repaying a gift of gratitude to Athena, the manly goddess, for her sound advice, at that time when he, or perhaps she, with fire-breathing destruction, reduced to ashes the holy city, though not numbered among the foremost Achaean fighters, has now gone along the road of Homer. Thrice blessed is he whom in your heart you," and then here the grammar cannot be sustained any longer, "good fortune of that sort lives forever." If the reader, now thoroughly confused, continues into the lower half of the Acts, reevaluates, and realizes the poem's trick, then all becomes clear. The Phocian, opaquely held out as the subject in the first line, is identified as Epeius in the second. The holy city of line 3 turns out to be Troy, that is, the city of the Dardanids in line 4, and so on and so forth. The Acts thus works remarkably well as what might be termed an antithetic riddle poem, in which the solution to the riddling language of the text is unlocked by the realization that it is meant to be read antithetically. Second, I would submit that the poem's singular direction of reading can be effectively integrated with its themes and imagery if we pay attention to the relationship between form and content that I have been highlighting in this paper. In the first few lines, Simmias's description of the violence wrought by Epeius's acts mimics the physical pattern in which the reader must process the text itself. At the end of the second and lowest line, the axe has literally cast down the height, katerepsen aipos, of the god-built towers of Troy, just as the axe has cast the reader's eye from the top line all the way down to the bottom, as if mirroring Troy's precipitous fall. Simmias reprises this maneuver in the fourth and second lowest line, where the axe has thrust the Trojan lords ek themethlon, literally from the foundations or from the lowest parts. Likewise, Epeius's status as a lowly water carrier is introduced in the third lowest line of the poem, line 6. His figurative ascent to the status of Homeric celebrity in line 7 is matched by the reader's literal ascent back to the upper half of the poem. In a word, the reversals in the direction of reading reinforce, or better yet, illustrate the poem's themes of reversals of fortune. Troy's gilded lords have lost their prosperous city to literally fire-breathing destruction, peripno, whereas the once lowly Epeius has gained a good fortune that literally breathes forever, aepne, because of Athena's aid and his commemoration in Homeric verse. Finally, with the assonant tag in lines 11 through 12 that Velizar also admired, hod obos aepne, good fortune of that sort lives forever, the poem ends, and with it, the cycle of ups and downs that characterize the reader's progress through the poem likewise comes to a halt. At this point, at the iconic center of the acts, the reader at last returns to the normal practice of reading consecutive lines in a downward direction, and then reads no more. The effect makes for a satisfying closural device that suggests the eternal fixity of Epeius's happiness, ae, now safely removed from the topsy-turvy world of taiki, or fortune. The acts thus shows Simmias's remarkably thoughtful exploitation of this unique intermedial form, in which text as language, text as image, and even the movement of the reader's own eyes through the text can interact in complex ways to produce meaning. It is my hope that this paper has showcased a new method for approaching the ancient shape poems, at least in the Greek canon, It is only when our readings are sensitive to considerations of text and image, time and space, and most importantly, the dynamic interactions among these elements, that we can do full justice to the artistic complexity of this fascinating subgenre of epigram. Thank you very much for your attention.